Welcome to this week's episode of Trump's America. I'm your host, Mick Larson. This week's topic is the anti-civil rights movement. My guest is Dr. Michael Collins. He's an author and associate professor of English at Texas A&M University. His latest book is titled The Anti-Civil Rights Movement, Affirmative Action as Wedge and Weapon. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Michael has learned while researching and writing this important book. All right, let's do this. Michael, welcome to the podcast. And before we get into your book, can you kind of give us like a 30,000-foot view of the history of how we take a stride forward in civil rights, a step forward, and then two steps back historically, and obviously it's happening currently as well?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor. So I guess you can go all the way back to the beginning of the country if you want to talk about the history of civil rights, because basically slavery or an accommodation for slavery was written into the Constitution, the original version of the Constitution. And although the slave trade was supposed to end after a period of time, there was no provision for abolishing slavery, which eventually created tensions as the nation expanded, and there was dispute about which new territories could have slaves and which wouldn't have slaves. And tensions rose. The abolitionist movement emerged, and Abraham Lincoln is elected. The Republican Party is viewed as anti-slavery, and this precipitates the secession of a kind of domino role of southern states in the beginning of the Civil War. After the Civil War, North is victorious. Initially, the South tried to kind of re-enslave African Americans by passing laws, sometimes called Black Codes, which kind of restricted movement, restricted employment to basically field labor, domestic labor. So in other words, the same thing as before. And so the federal government stepped in first with civil rights laws, and then when these were obstructed with obviously the 13th Amendment to end slavery, but then the 14th Amendment to guarantee, among other things, equal rights before the law. And part of that was that the federal government could enforce civil rights against states that were trying to kind of essentially either re-enslave or trap people in debt, peonage, and so on. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, voting rights for African American men. And so, and this whole suite of laws was the beginning of the Reconstruction, when African Americans were, elected to Congress and to state government, and they put in some really important things like public schools and so on, from which everybody could benefit. But then a deal was struck with the North, and there were Northern troops in the South at the time, but then a deal was struck to withdraw the Northern troops, and this resulted in a kind of retrenchment on the part of the South, where they instituted basically segregation, second-class citizenship, which lasted through the civil rights movements of the 1950s, which is kind of what we think about when we say civil rights movement. Right. He was like, I guess I'm going on too long.
No.
Luther King. So anyway, that's believe it or not, that's a capsule version.
But there's always this tension of the white people, conservatives particularly, trying to always go back and circumvent the laws, like segregation. Obviously, once the troops left the South, it became fair game for the states to just basically do whatever they wanted to do. So talk about that dynamic a little bit, about the resistance and the backlash to all these things.
Okay. Derek Bell, the lawyer and writer and theorist, talks about his kind of interest convergence principle, or interest convergence dilemma, where basically Black progress is only tolerated to the extent that it benefits whites. and there'll be a backlash against it when the whites are view themselves as having to basically give up something. And so, like, we're all for equality. Well, not that we're all, but some of us
In principle.
for equality, as long as it doesn't, like, bite us anywhere or appear to bite us anywhere. And I think it's just to some extent it has to do with race, but my argument partly in the book is it's partly to do with human nature a little bit. And I use this. I draw upon this idea of the prisoner's dilemma, which, like, is a idea from game theory, but I'm not trying to use a math. I'm trying to use a story
Right.
of the prisoner's dilemma, and the way it goes. One version of it is, okay, two people are captured by law enforcement, and they're partners in some kind of crime, and the law enforcement, they separate them and they interrogate them separately, and they pressure them by saying basically your buddy's going to sell you out and you should make a deal, because if you tell us, if you confess to this major crime that we think you committed, you can go free and your buddy will get a harsh sentence. And they say the same thing each person, but the caveat is that if neither one of them talks, all the people can do is kind of give them a slap on the wrist, a relative slap on the wrist. But it makes more sense to talk, because if they both confess, they won't get the heaviest sentence. Whereas if only one confesses, the other guy, the book will be thrown at the person who didn't confess. And so game theorists find that it's logical to basically sell the other guy out. And I say it's human nature because I think that kind of pressure really exists. And you could see it a little bit, I would argue, even in the results of the recent election, where like one of the big headlines was that Trump got an unprecedented number of Latino men and some African American men, and so it's the idea that it's a race. Of course, race played a big role, but the Haitians are eating dogs, like all that kind of rhetoric.
Yeah.
But it's more than race. It's more like the game here says you defect from a coalition when you basically confess. And so, like, going to vote for Trump in spite of all that racialized rhetoric, and in spite of policies that arguably will, if they're carried out, will really hurt poor people. To me, that's, you could explain that a little bit by this kind of game theory, like defection. Like, I'll be a little bit better off if I go with him than if I stick to my coalition, especially with Black men that I've traditionally been part of. So that's why I say it's partly human nature, and part of, like, what I guess the civil rights movement wants to do is, like, try to appeal to the better angels of human nature and say, look, in fact, you will be better off, because that's the lesson of the prisoner's dilemma. You will be better off if you work together with a marginalized group, or fellow members or other marginalized groups. But it's just very hard to do that under the normal pressures of life.
Hearing you say that reminds me of something that I've, since a month after the election, I've been trying to, I listen to everybody's opinion about what they think reasons why. Was it economy? Was it culture? And it's like, I think for the white people, it was culture. And what you just said makes me think for Black and Latino men, it was more about economics.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
the culture is not good for them, particularly. Um, and
Although
the
it's
white folks want to get rid of the culture that we're presently in. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that you just made me think about that.
Yeah, although there's a culture element too, because some analysts, and I haven't studied this, but I've just heard people say that part of the attraction of Trump is machismo. Like,
Sure.
he's like the ultimate macho dude. I mean, he plays the ultimate macho dude
Yeah.
on TV,
Right.
and so, like, that's kind of an attraction, and also the idea of resentment of political correctness, this kind of thing, discomfort with transgender people, although that's, like, really kind of a non-issue. But he made it this huge. I think they spent $50 million or some huge amount
Yes, they
on this
did.
one commercial that pushed the idea of, like, transgender people are I don't know, coming to your bathroom or something like that.
Well,
So
the ad was talking about how your tax dollars are going towards
right,
transgender surgery for
right,
immigrants, and some I think I know Kamala said that she was going to. I think that was part of the ad that
yes,
people in jail were going to be able to do the
right,
operation tax funded. So yeah, it was
right.
it was,
So
and of course they ended it was like Donald Trump's not for he him or she. Donald Trump's for you. So
yes,
it
yes,
was
that's right.
unfortunately it was a great ad.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I'm not a fan of Trump, I gotta say, in terms of manipulation of the public, the guy is brilliant, or whoever's around him.
No,
These guys are
I
brilliant.
agree.
And the
But
other thing is, go ahead.
yeah, it's easy to run on fear and hatred. It's
Oh,
a
yes,
lot harder to run on hope and hey, let's get some things done because it's more not as because as humans we obviously identify with fear much easier than hope.
yeah. And the other thing too, it's much harder to make a reasoned case evaluating actual facts, and it takes like a lot of more work to do that than just to say you're being invaded. I mean, whether or not it's true, if you repeat it often enough, people think it might be true. And but if you have to say, well, uh, the job market has been doing well, wages have been trending upward, blah blah blah. I mean, you put half the people to sleep, and all the other guys just got to do is like scream fire in a crowded theater, and that's the way it goes.
Yeah, I was just talking to that with a podcast guest yesterday. Is that um, it's just like you just said, it's easier to yell fire opposed to saying, "Hey, since COVID was over, the U.S. economy has done better than any economy in the world. We have the best landing so far." It's like objectively, we are doing better than anybody on the planet.
Yes,
But the price of eggs and gas are still high. You know, but relatively
yeah.
speaking, you're in much better shape. So
Not only that, but
that nuance is a problem.
yeah, and I think the media, like they're kind of drawn to, if it bleeds, it leads, and
Yeah.
so like it's a more boring story to talk about like all these a million people over here got jobs. It's much more interesting to say this person over here can't buy eggs, or feels like buying eggs is too difficult to make the family budget. You'll get that story 100 times, and you'll get the jobs thing. It's just a statistics and no detail. So anyway,
Yes,
I can
yes.
see I can rave about this all day.
Well, my next question is like, is it fair to say we have always had a certain level of white backlash, white grievance to deal with? And like, I'm thinking of groups like the John Birch Society, the Daughters of the Confederacy, that civil rights advocates always have to kind of deal with, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's true. One of the storylines in my book is about the rise of Ronald Reagan. And one of the things that got him, he was a Goldwater supporter, and he gave a major speech in support of Goldwater, where he called out students, similar to now, actually, students at the University of California, Berkeley, who were like, protesting the war and expressing sympathy for civil rights, and like having uh, these daily events, protests, and also consciousness raising events in one of the university's central parklets. And he's saying, basically they should have been thrown out of school the first day. So that was part of it. And then there was another thing in California where there was a backlash to integration of housing. And Reagan, he really danced around the issue very expertly. And I think I say in the book that he said that he was managed to convince one journalist that he was both in favor of the house homeowners being able to discriminate against black renters and buyers, and for civil rights. Like he somehow was able to, which is like, again, like these guys in a way are kind of geniuses in terms of like their ability to bamboozle the public in a way. So that's an example of a backlash there, which helped to put Reagan in office and set him up for really becoming the president and really transforming the country to this extent. New York Review of Books had an article a few years ago saying that we were like in the 40th year of the Reagan presidency. So,
Well, and
um,
obviously he kicks off his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, on
Yeah, for the
purpose
president. Yeah, President. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly
and
right. Yeah,
talked about welfare queens.
exactly right. Exactly right. And he was early on like slamming affirmative action. I mean, now he's remembered as this like happy warrior, uh, morning in America, but he got a lot of the same kind of Trumpian rhetoric into the public bloodstream also.
Um, I've always felt like we're still fighting the Civil War, and with Trump's election twice now, kind of confirms my feelings. What are your thoughts on that idea that we're still fighting the Civil War?
Yeah, we're still fighting the ideas and the sentiment behind the Civil War. Maybe not the Civil War itself, but those ideas
Obviously,
and
we're not using guns, but we're using votes and at the ballot versus. But it seems like we're still dealing with all the same issues.
oh yeah, and in terms of like the kind of raw material that the politicians have to work with, it's very similar to the Civil War. And like one of the stories I tell in the book is about the reaction to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And there's this judge, Tom P. Brady, who gave a lecture called Black Monday, and it was supposed to be Black Monday when basically the South was defeated. And this is how he presented it, as the South was defeated by the forces of integration, and he equated integration with miscegenation. In other words, black-white uh, uh, sexual relationships. And basically said, they're going to put, black kids in the class with your white daughter, and it's and this is and he went into this kind of weird fantasy where he said like this is how white civilizations have always fallen. It's because of miscegenation. And he talks about and he attributes Mayan civilization. He said that was a white civilization, and it fell because of miscegenation. And then he talks about the Civil War, and he says, the boot of the conqueror was on our necks, and this new Brown decision is like a kind of reiteration of that. And he talks about all these basically 20th century civil rights developments that he sees as like kind of putting chains around the South. And so he gave this Black Monday speech a couple of hundred times, and he was able to raise money, he said, for the White Citizens Council, which played a major role in trying to push back against Martin Luther King and the other civil rights leaders.
Um, well, that's a perfect segue to let's get into your book. It's titled Anti-Civil Rights Movement, Affirmative Action as a Wedge and a Weapon. Was this book a long time coming for you, or was there some particular spark that ignited your path to write this?
So I guess it was a long time coming in the sense that, like the whole affirmative action debate was always kind of in the corner of my eye, and I noticed it, and I kind of not like it much, but I wouldn't think about it, back in, when I was in college, and even before then. But when I came to Texas A&M, which is where I teach, one of the first things I saw, well, not one of the first things that caught my attention on campus, was this conservative student group that was having an affirmative action bake sale, where basically if you bought a cookie, I think if you were a white person, you were charged more, and if you were like a black person, I mean, if you were Latino, you were charged less, and then if you're a black person, you're charged the least. And so the message was like, basically like these guys have it easier than whites. And there were like always these little things that would happen, like mostly people are very friendly, and I have no problem with these things that would happen that catch my attention, to say like, well, we haven't really gotten past this whole race thing, have we? And then I got uh, I knew the editor at Harper's Magazine, and he asked me like to pitch him some ideas, and so I pitched him some, and he said, "Oh, the Affirmative Action, that sounds good." And so that's really how the book started. Was I wrote that article, and I incorporated some of what I saw at Texas A&M, and also like kind of the culmination was basically somebody who was not affiliated with Texas A&M invited a white nationalist to speak on campus, and and so that really made me think, yeah, we've got to get into this. And at the time, this was at the time of the Grutter decision, by the Supreme Court, which allowed affirmative action to come back to Texas after it had been suspended for a while. And so that was like, so I started to tell that story and where the Great decision came from, and why all these tensions are still around in America and on the campus. And so that's really was the origin of the book. And then I looked for a publisher, which took a while till I finally found UPK, University Press of Kansas. And as they say, the rest is a lot of midnight oil.
What was your initial thesis of the book going into it, and kind of where did that take you?
Well, my initial thesis, like kind of going back to your earlier question, was that a lot of this is about status. A lot of, that was my initial thesis. I ended up like doing shifting it, but a lot of it is about this battle for status and the battle to maintain status. And so, and it's not so much even about like getting a seat in a university, because there are enough universities that people can go anywhere, but people want to go to these high status schools. And and since the seats there are on purpose very limited, it becomes a battle. And so the reason like people worry about affirmative action is because every little element of a person's record and even their life plays into whether or not they get admitted. And so they start to say, wait a minute, I did all this stuff and look at this guy. What did he do? And then they say, well, it's affirmative action. And so it's a battle for status, which is also a battle for access to what I call in the book agenda setting power. Because if you go to Harvard, I mean, you do have a better shot probably at getting a high profile job and then becoming an influential person, or becoming or being able to network with influential people. So status does have this kind of real world result in terms of your income and where you live and so on.
Can you walk us through the progression that conservative activists use to get to the point where we have all these anti-civil rights decisions going on now?
Okay, it's a long story. I mean, one of the early ones is like Brady. I mean, he was able to help fund this major institution that was an anti-civil rights institution, and Goldwater campaign, I guess, is the Barry Goldwater campaign for president in 1964. And Barry Goldwater was somebody who voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and he had kind of these highfalutin reasons why. It was like a restriction on freedom. It was about freedom. It wasn't necessarily about
Oh, it
race.
was states' rights, Michael. Come on.
Yes. And but the Goldwater campaign was like this incubator for basically a lot of the people who really like made America what it is today. Not only Reagan, but Richard Sciaffi, who was this like major donor to conservative causes, was kind of involved in the Goldwater campaign. And this guy, I keep using this word genius. Maybe I shouldn't. People are going to take me the wrong way. But
You could say evil genius if you'd like.
Well, no, because they believe they're good. But there's this guy, this strategist, Paul Weyrich, who was involved in the Goldwater campaign, the losing campaign. And he went on to work for a congressman. And on one occasion, the congressman was supposed to attend a meeting of civil rights organizations, and he couldn't go, and so Weyrich went instead. And he said, I described in the book as like a primal moment where you see your parents having sex, according to Freud. And what happened is, he said, I saw these guys, they're a religious organization that came in order to fight against the Nixon initiative. And so the religious organization said, we're going to do this. The civil rights organization said, well, we're going to do that. And there's a senator, like a kind of like a turncoat Republican senator, who's going to, make this countermeasure bipartisan. And he said, like, I saw this huge network of organizations, and he said, I saw why we were always losing in Congress and in the government. And he said, I became obsessed. And he said, I want to, with starting counter organizations. And so he became like one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation. and he was helped to kind of midwife the moral majority with Jerry Falwell,
Hmm.
and those two organizations played a significant role in the election of Ronald Reagan, because the moral majority helped to mobilize evangelical voters, which was a major constituency for Reagan. And the Heritage Foundation provided a lot of like the ideas that or helped to develop a lot of the ideas that were then implemented during the Reagan administration. So that was kind of so Wyrick is, and he's funded lots of other organizations too. Like it's like he was
Yeah.
always looking over his shoulder. Like if I don't find this other one, the liberals are going to get me. So, but he was only one guy. There's like John M. Olin. I don't know how long you want me to go on in this.
No, no, that was my next question is like, who are some of the characters behind these movements? So yes, that's
Yeah. All right. So John M. Olin was a wealthy person who was in who had patents on various weapons, and he was a great like hunter. And like supposedly he would send, I think he boxes of salmon or something to Nixon, and he was a benefactor of Cornell University, which is his alma mater. And I think the library at Cornell is named the Olin Library. And but there was a kind of infamous event at Cornell. I think it's the early 70s. I don't have the exact date off the top of my head. But when Black students took over a building, an administration building at Cornell, and one of them, they held the building for a while, and then when they left, like one of them had a gun in his hand, and so Owen saw this, and he said, "What the this place I'm spending all this money to, what is going on?" And so people like Owen thought it was like the end of civilization. And at the time, Alan Blum was on the faculty at Cornell, and he also saw it as an end of civilization moment. And he later wrote a book, "The Closing of the American Mind," that became a bestseller, which is kind of like a precursor of a lot of the kind of uh, the anti-woke thought that are kind of dominating America now. And so Olin, who had a philanthropic foundation already that was doing things like funding school libraries, he repurposed it, and he said basically we're going to form a counterintelligentsia, and he gave the foundation a tremendous amount of money. He gave it a certain time to spend all of the money, and so they have to fund conservative public interest law firms, which played a big role in some of the defeats that the civil rights movement went on to suffer. They helped to fund this organization called the National Association of Scholars, NAS, which later on helped to undo affirmative action in California, and then played a role in the battling against affirmative action in Michigan. And so people like Olin and Scaffi, who I mentioned before, they just poured millions of dollars into these new startup conservative think tanks and legal organizations, and basically, I guess you could say they won. I mean, they did they did very well. Uh,
unfortunately.
yes, yeah. Another one of these one of these conservative public interest law firms. Should I go out and tell this example?
Yeah, yeah.
Was the Center for Individual Rights, and they brought some major anti-affirmative action cases, including one I mentioned before, the Grutter case against the University of Michigan Law School, and also the Gratz case against the University of Michigan undergraduate college, and they won the Gratz case, uh, but they lost the Grutter case, which is why affirmative action was able to continue more or less until 2023 in higher education. But I guess my point is this kind of um, uh, this combination of like deep pocketed aggravated donors combined with like these kind of conservative ideologues and idealists, I guess you could say, in the think tank world and the legal foundation world, combined, and it became this kind of almost unstoppable force in American life.
They definitely obviously had a way outsized impact on our culture and civil rights and everything. It's really it's a network of people that no unless you're really like you've written a book or into a very liberal podcast, like you're never going to hear this stuff. You know, once
Yeah,
in a while you'll hear about the Heritage Foundation or the folks that are offering out Supreme Court justices. You'll hear about that, but that's
yeah. Well, in the Federalist Society
yeah.
early on, I think they got money from Olin too. So, and not only Olin, but there's like there's a Bradley Foundation. There's a long list of these places that, like you say, they're never on the news. Once in a while, you'll see them on C-SPAN, but they'll just say so and so is from the American Enterprise Institute, but they don't like going to any of the any of the
Well,
history.
and that is kind of the funny thing is like all these institutes and organizations in DC, you don't know what they're, what is the heritage? You just hear, oh, he's from the Heritage Foundation. You're like, well, what do they do? What is their principles? What's their motivation?
Yeah, and it's interesting though. Well, I guess I always try to caveat things like Norm Ornstein. I think used to be at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's somebody who seems to be kind of like just an intellectual who wants to figure things out. But then there are like these really serious ideologues. I think they dominate, and um, and like Edward Blum, who is the one who kind of gave the big blow to affirmative action, was associated for a long time with the American Enterprise Institute, and other people that he worked with to kind of develop. The other thing they do, one of the most interesting things about this, is that it's not that they people like Bloom bring court cases, but they also develop all the intellectual tools they need and the studies they need in order to make the strongest possible case. And they do that through institutions like American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, Bradley, like funding or being resident scholars at these places. And so, and another thing that's in terms of like them being victorious is that by bringing these cases, they also uh, shape the public discussion of the issues that they're bringing cases about. And even before the Grutter and Gratz cases were decided, Terry Kell, who was the head of the Center for Individual Rights at the time, he said, in a way, we've already won because the public opinion about affirmative action has already shifted. And there's like it's already declined in terms of the support it had. And so, in a way, we've already gotten what we wanted, even if we don't win the case. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing. Like bringing these cases is a way of, in a way, shaping the media narrative.
Yeah, and obviously it happens not only civil rights but women's rights, Native
Yes.
American rights. I know, like the Koch brothers are funding a lot of stuff. They're trying to get rid of sovereignty for Native American. It's like,
Yes.
they are busy beavers and trying to roll back everything. It's like we need. These are my words, not yours. We need to make America white again.
So, but I mean, yeah, you're right. The Koch brothers, though, like one of the things I'll say, forget about, I don't know if it's white or what, but we're going to make America green again. That's really what they're after, because the Koch brothers, like they were major factors behind the Citizen United decision, which allowed anonymous money to be poured into uh, PACs,
Yep.
and that was one of the major things that helped Trump to win both 2016 and 2024. Is like this enormous downpour of
Yeah.
money, I think it's like I don't know. I always hesitate to say like it's only about race because it's really about power, and it's really about of course race plays a part because
It's a
you want power
subset
to
for
go to
sure.
people like yourself. You want the power to be with people like yourself whom you think we're good people. Why shouldn't we run things? And so, but it's really about like as I always use this term, agenda setting power. In the book, you don't want like the civil rights leaders to set the agenda. You want to set the agenda. You don't want the kids who took over the hall at Cornell to set the agenda. You John M. Olin, you want to set the agenda because you've built up this huge business. You're a job. I mean, I don't know if you use the term job creator, but you're a job creator,
Yeah.
so I think that's really what it's about. And race, of course, plays a role, but not only that, that's why you get into gender too. Like in terms of you, you know uh, restrictions on even the right to choose and so on. I think.
In your book, you talk about how activists undermine the shared interest of American people by splitting up coalitions and pitting, marginalized groups against each other. Can you talk a little bit about that and give an example of how that works?
Yeah, the best example is Christopher Rufo. And he was the guy who went on the Tucker Carlson show, I think it was in 2020. And he said, addressing basically Donald Trump directly, was the president at the time, saying critical race theory has infiltrated the government and it's a danger to the republic. And you have to do something about this. And I think like the next day, the Trump administration started working on an executive order to combat this horrible danger of critical race theory. But the interesting thing about it is that Rufo didn't really care if anybody understood what critical race theory was, and he said in a tweet something to the effect that we're just going to make the American people think that anything they dislike is critical race theory. So it didn't matter what critical race theory actually was. It was just like we're going to. And he's been again incredibly successful. And then after critical race theory, they went on to
They went after
gender,
DEI, didn't they?
yeah, DEI, in more generally, and then and also gender, trans issues and so on, which I think is part of where this commercial comes from. I mean, you can trace a lot of it back to this, and of course, where is Christopher Rufo based, American Enterprise Institute. Although he later got a job, Ron DeSantis gave him a job, I think, running or playing a major role in a university in Florida, where he was going to get rid of all the DEI. So they're activists like that, and they're scholar activists, you could say. Not so much Alan Bloom, who I think was a real scholar who had he had certain views, he had conservative views, but somebody like Charles Murray,
Mhm.
Richard Herrenstein, and Charles Murray. He wrote a book funded by major conservative think tanks called "Losing Ground" that influenced a lot of U.S. policy in terms of like how to basically reduce the welfare state. He basically said it's even counterproductive, and there are other things you can do. And he even gave like at one point in an article for Commentary Magazine, he gave an analogy. You know, uh, alluding to Jonathan Swift's modest proposal, where Jonathan Swift talks about like the Irish are growing too or multiplying too quickly, and we need to do something to reduce their population. And he gave a modest proposal where you could even penalize parents for having kids and so on, and like put these like draconian restrictions. He says, of course, this couldn't happen. I know it couldn't happen, but nevertheless, uh, the welfare state is not really much better than this kind of an extreme thing.
Mhm.
And then that was his that was his moderate book. Because it was still, trying to be a little bit empathetic. But then
Mhm.
his next kind of book was The Bell Curve, which
Mhm.
he co-wrote with Richard Herrenstein, a psychologist. And the Bell Curve, it basically created all kinds of graphs and data that it used to quote unquote prove that blacks were intellectually below the level of whites, and that if you gave them affirmative action, it was kind of a waste because they couldn't really benefit from it. And if they went to they even write about like if they go to like a selected college, everybody will know that they're not up to snuff because of the way they behave in the library and stuff like that. So and this was supposed to be like this scientific treatise. It's like I don't know how like 600 or 800 pages long, and it was again very impactful. And so with that kind of blurring of the lines between quote unquote science and activism, you start to get this kind of mythology about race and blacks
Oh,
and like like,
you're yeah, you're basically supporting tropes from the last few hundred years with
right,
some data. That's basically what he's doing.
with some data
Or
which is like very like distorted and
yeah,
another thing about the bell curve is that um um it was produced in such a way that sympathetic columnists were brought in to find to I think that they were flown into Washington to get a seminar on it, and so they could write about it before actual scholars could get a look at it. And so by the time the actual scholars got a look at it and said this is crap, the it was
like
too late in a way
like you
because it
said,
was already.
the agenda has already been set.
That's right. That's right. And so it's amazing the kind of focus of these groups. They're all hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, probably hundreds of organizations, and yet this kind of focus. And you have people who are able to disavow the bell curve. Oh no, we don't go that far, and yet they still kind of benefit from this kind of renewal of stereotypes that a book like that creates. So it's a little diabolical.
Very diabolical. I mean, it's kind of the same thing of George Floyd, obviously he was murdered, but they don't want to talk about the murder. They want to talk about George Floyd's background.
Right.
And it's like, no
And
matter what your background is, you don't deserve to be murdered by the police.
that's right. And even like worse than that, I mean, there's nothing worse than, but even more damaging than that is the fact that the way the protests against George Floyd are portrayed. Now, I mean, against the murder of George Floyd are portrayed, because now if you bring it up, it's always, well,
Oh
they
yeah.
tried to burn down half of America, and George
Yes.
Floyd and his murderers are just forgotten. And then that's associated with DEI, which then becomes this thing where you have to shut down DEI in colleges because it's educating young people to be destructive of American values. And so it's this kind of really vicious circle that the American mind gets trapped in.
Well, and it's also very I don't know how exactly how they do it, but they do it really well. Is taking words like affirmative action, woke, DEI, and just turning it into something else, and obviously weaponizing it.
Yes. Yeah. And that's one of the things that Rufo, he's just very explicit about it. I'm gonna empty out this term. I'm gonna stuff it with what I want. And it's gonna serve our purposes. It's gonna serve the purposes. And he directly says that in one of his tweets that we're already starting to see like a split between the Black and Asian coalition. So and so like these guys are, they're not just doing these things at random. They have like a well thought out plan for doing it. So
It's like there's a lot of people on the left saying we need to get rid of identity politics, and it always makes me laugh because like, well, our country was founded on an identity politics because you had to look like me and own land to vote.
yes,
That's to say we need to get rid of. It's like, but then they use politics all the time as well. So it's like I don't actually see identity politics as being a bad thing. It's like you're identifying your constituency and you're going to fight for your constituency. I don't really see what the problem is there, but anyway.
yeah. Well, I think again it goes back to this issue of status. I think Eddie Glaude, the Princeton scholar, I saw him on TV, and he was saying that you white Trump politics is very much identity politics. It's
Of
for
course it
putting
is.
forward a certain vision, and they even talk about real Americans. And when they talk about real Americans, you don't necessarily picture somebody who looks like Eddie Glaude as an African American person. And so it's identity politics, but it's naturalized identity politics, and that's one of the things. Like the old idea that the normative American is a white male, and anything that's not a white male is a deviation. And
Right.
so, and if you say like this, well, I'm not a deviation, I'm equal, then you're practicing identity politics. But if you just don't talk about it and you assume that the white male is the normative and you try to be as much like the white male as possible, then identity politics is gone, right? So
That's right.
yeah, so I think that's I mean, it's devilishly clever, I gotta say.
What I'm curious, in your research, what was the reaction to affirmative action when President Kennedy, did the executive order back in 1961? I think it was. Yeah.
I think for a long time, affirmative action was under the radar. Kennedy did it, and he didn't have many teeth in terms of like enforcement in his executive order. And so it's really after Lyndon Johnson issued executive order 11246. I think it was 1965, when he did put some teeth where, like, if you were a federal contractor, you had to make some affirmative action efforts. Even then, it was still under the radar for a while, because that was like the height of the civil rights movement, and everybody could see on television, you know, the horrible treatment that the civil rights protesters were getting, and everybody thought, well, yeah, something needs to be done.
Right.
Current commission report says, after there were like urban disturbances, that there needs to be black men need to have access to higher status jobs, better wages, and so on. And so there was like this kind of national consensus, you could say, that okay, maybe things like affirmative actions are necessary. So I think there wasn't that much of backlash for it. And I have some statistics in the book, or some polls in the book, where there was like a majority support for it early on. But cue the backlash. I guess you could say maybe with Nixon and the Law and Order campaign and the Southern strategy, to appeal to basically white grievance, that's when the things started to turn around. And then one of the big moments in the shift was the case of the Bakke case. The Alan Bakke sued the University of California, Davis, for discrimination because he had been rejected, and he thought he'd been rejected because the University of California, Davis had had a 10% goal to enroll disadvantaged people who could be Black, Asian, Latino, Native American, or white. Actually, there wasn't a restriction on it, but he immediately assumed like he was being kept out of the school, the medical school, because he was a white person, and lesser qualified minority students were getting in. And the Bakke case became like a massive cause celebre, like massively covered by the media. And I think that was kind of like another part where things start to turn against affirmative action. Even though it survived the Bakke case, because Justice Lewis Powell, who wrote the opinion, said that adding diversity to a college population had positive educational value. And so if a person added diversity, he could get some affirmative action. But he couldn't be compensated for discrimination. Like if you couldn't be given affirmative action because these people had been discriminated against for hundreds of years. But if they brought this positive contribution of diversity, they could get it.
Yeah, and I've always said, white men have had affirmative action for 400 years. This country was set up and built for them. So it's like, oh, we've had affirmative action for people of color for 60 years, and whoa, that's way too much.
Yeah. There's a book called When Affirmative Action Was White. Katzelson, I think his name is. Yeah. And he does talk about, like the GI Bill.
Oh yeah.
Went to like white soldiers, like the black soldiers can get it, and so like all that you could, this boost towards homeownership, which builds generational wealth. Blacks were mostly excluded from that.
Totally missed out on that. I think if you look at the generational wealth, that discrimination after World War II with the GI Bill, I mean, that's caused an incredible amount of harm, and obviously harm that we're still dealing with.
But if you bring it up, it's identity politics.
You've kind of talked around this, but specifically, how have conservatives weaponized affirmative action and used it, like you said, as a wedge and a weapon?
Well, the best example is the use. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. The conservative narrative that Asian Americans have been hurt by affirmative action. and so that's one of the big issues I try to tackle in the book. And basically, in the Supreme Court case against Harvard, there was the double case against the University of North Carolina, and then one against Harvard. They said that Asian applicants were discriminated against because there is, I think, like a personality score. I'm missing the term now, that that worked against Asian Americans. But then some analysts found that it actually didn't. It didn't like lessen their chances the way that Edward Blum, who brought this case,
Okay.
claimed. But okay, that's, I guess, the end of the story. Let me go back to the beginning. The beginning of the story is the idea of Asian Americans as a model minority who don't like indulge in crime and who are able to like work hard and get ahead and achieve the American dream without any kind of special considerations. And so, and of course, this is used. This narrative is used to say that, well, look at white and black people. They've gotten all these benefits. Why aren't they able to achieve the American dream on their own? There must be something wrong with them because there's a model minority over here, and Latinos too, and this model minority over here that's doing well. And so that's a bit of a myth, uh, although it's a very convenient myth for conservatives. And part of the reason is that, and I talk about it in the book, is that some scholars have found that immigration law, which admits people who have skills that they contribute, like education, technical skills. It leads to a disproportionate number of Asian immigrants being, highly educated and able to, to do well in the job market, and also their children to do well educationally. But that's like translated into a racial difference instead of like really an educational and economic difference.
Right.
And so that's how you get the small minority. And of course, Blum, he advertised for Asian plaintiffs, and he went to Houston and he gave a talk advocating for Asian plaintiffs. And somebody asked him in the audience, but okay, let's say you get rid of affirmative action for race. What if people wanted to have affirmative action for LGBTQ? And he said, that's fine. I don't care. If Harvard wants to admit people who are good dancers and to give them affirmative action, that's cool. But race is unique. And the interesting thing is that his organization is called Students for Fair Admission. And so like the key word is fair. And so for him, the only thing that can be unfair is any consideration of race. But if you consider anything else, no problem. So that's an example of how it's used as a wedge, because I remember Rufo said we're driving a wedge between Asians and blacks, and so that's an example of it.
What was some of the ramifications of the Shelby County v. Holder decision?
Okay, that's another Blum case, because Blum wants to eliminate racial considerations from all government activity, basically. And the Shelby County case was a case he brought because states that had formerly been segregated or had discriminated against blacks and other minorities had to get pre-clearance for changes to their voting rights laws under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And then there's a formula, pre-clearance formula in Section 4. And so if you fulfill the formula, then you would have to get the pre-clearance. So Blum brought a case on behalf of Shelby County to get them to free them from having to get pre-clearance, because they were finding it to be expensive and onerous and so on. And so the case went to the Supreme Court, and Blum, he wins so often. He won as usual. And after that, they struck down. They didn't strike down Section 5, but they struck down the formula, because they said Congress should have revised it. And after that, what do you know? Like a lot of these states started to implement voting restrictions that negatively affected blacks. And one law was struck down is like so surgically targeting black voters, which was like clearly unconstitutional. And so Blum, they asked him about it, and he said, "Well, maybe some people are going too far, but basically my intention was good." So,
Well, and the ironic thing about the Shelby decision is that they did exactly what they weren't supposed to be. The whole it must be it's like the Roberts Court. It just is amazing. It's like, yeah, those things were in place for a good reason, and the minute you took them away, they started doing the things that it's ridiculous.
It's crazy. And Sonia Sotomayor even said, like, to the lawyer who was appearing on behalf of Shelby County in the oral argument, she said, basically, why are you even in here? Your county has like hundreds of violations. So, but nevertheless,
Well, and
uh,
that kind of segues to my next question is like, how anti-civil rights has the Roberts Supreme Court become?
in a way, it's a combination of, it's the tip of the spear in a certain way, because part of the reasons that they are able to, they had a majority before Shelby County. I mean, at the time of Shelby County, but they now have a super majority. And that's one of the reasons why affirmative action was able to be struck down, and why Roe versus Wade was struck down. I don't know if you consider that a civil right, to be able to determine what happens with your own body. And so, I guess you could say pretty anti-civil rights. But again, it goes back to a long story, which we might not have time to tell. We're just the capsule version of it is that Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader at the time, he prevented Obama from filling a vacant seat after Antonin Scalia died, and he kept the seat open until Trump came to office and filled it. I think it was Neil Gorsuch, and then Amy Coney Barrett died towards the end of Trump's. I mean, not Amy Coney.
Yeah.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg died
Yep.
towards the end of Trump's term, and Mitch McConnell, who had said, "Well, we can't appoint anybody so close to the election," he just slammed her right in there. So
I think it took like 45 days and they were done. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they have this super majority now, which also gave Trump kind of uh, immunity from being prosecuted for anything he does while he's in office, which is like this unprecedented presidential power. So at this point, the anti-civil rights movement, like, I guess they got a right to kind of dance in the aisles because they have so much power now.
I don't know if I don't. It's hard to get into somebody's head, but ultimately, is the motivation? Not the stated motivation of people like Blum and the Koch brothers and everybody, but what do you think their motivation is to do all these anti-civil rights efforts?
Okay, I can't look into Blum's soul, but I think when he looks in the mirror, he tells himself that he is righteous, that he is trying to make America live up to its best principles. I think he's like a true believer in his cause, although he does some kind of like shady things to to get to his result. But I think he's a true believer. Whereas somebody like Rufo, it just seems like
His
somebody's
opportunists.
an opportunist, somebody's incredibly cynical, and somebody who's kind of just likes to start fires. He's kind of like social pyromaniac in a certain way. Um, Mitch McConnell, I mean, all these guys are, they're like really complicated figures. Like a lot of people like say, or some journalists used to say, oh, he's an institutionalist, but he's an institutionalist for his goals. You
Right.
know, but he's not, I guess he's not like, somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz, who are
Right.
just, I seem to be like deeply
Not serious
narcissistic.
people. I mean, Mitch McConnell's a serious person and
Yeah,
a very smart person. And
yeah,
I can't say that about those other people you just mentioned.
yeah. And Trump, I guess he needs the ultimate because he's the one who makes a lot of this stuff possible because of his appeal to a wide swath of voters. I mean, he's like I think a very narcissistic person who doesn't really have like any kind of core beliefs, but except for the fact that he wants to have maximum power and maximum deference from as many people as possible. And so, you have, I guess my answer is like you have a spectrum of different kinds of characters. Somebody who's a true believer to somebody who believes in nothing.
Yeah, and I don't know what your analysis of this is, but to me it seems like Trump is not very ideological whatsoever and kind of an empty vessel when it comes to that. Like I don't think he for a moment gave any thought about trans people serving in the military. I doubt that he cares, even knew it was going on. But it's transactional though. So someone
Yes.
said, "Hey, I have a problem with this. I'll vote for you if you get rid of these. If you do this thing that I want." What are
Yeah,
your
I
thoughts
think
on
that's
that?
what it is. Yeah. One of the metaphors I have in the book is that it's called conservative three-card Monte. And I think in a way, Trump is the ultimate three-card Monte player. Like, and like, what does a three-card Monte player want? He wants your money. And Trump, he wants your vote and he wants your voice and he wants you to kind of like amplify his own voice and amplify his own power. And the idea of three-card Montes, which I think it goes to how the wedge is driven, is the three-card Monte game is the guy has three cards, two black and a red, and you have to find. He moves the cards around on the table at kind of lightning speed, and you have to figure out which card is a red card, which will let you win money and not lose money. And so my metaphor is that the black cards are equality and fairness, and then the red
Mhm.
card is racial inequality. Blacks are not equal, and so on. It's a bell curve argument. And a lot of these guys, like they say, we're all for equality and fairness, and they move the card so fast that you can't see the red card. And I think a lot of the people who defend Trump, not so much Trump himself, they're great three-card Monte players because they're always talking about equality and fairness. If you ever watch any debate on CNN or someplace, these guys are always like a very high principled as they're defending like something like that's indefensible. But Trump, he'll say anything to give himself an advantage in a particular moment. And so that's why I say he's also a pretty, and he'll deny like, oh no, I never said that. He'll say like Haitians eat dogs, and then a second later he's like, no, I didn't really say, I just heard that. And so that's how he plays his three-card Monte game, but he keeps winning.
My new tagline for the Republican Party is the party of the bait and switch.
Yes,
You know,
yes,
we're going to
yes,
lower the price of eggs and gas, but we're actually going to do tariffs, and let's see how that
yes,
goes.
yeah. But I mean, they rely on the fact that the people are not interested in policy details.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of voters just not interested, or I mean, people always
Or
say
have the
maybe they don't
time.
have
Yeah.
time. They don't have the time. But I always think, but look, you could go up to somebody and ask like, what are the stats of the number two quarterback in the Green Bay Packers, and they can tell you every damn stat. And so,
That's true.
I don't think it's that people have the time. It's just they're just
We don't
not
have the
interested.
interest. Yeah.
Yeah, and so and I guess they don't realize how much it affects their lives. Like in a way, like the game is more important. And like anyway.
Yeah. I agree with you 100%. You make a really good point there.
Yeah, but
um,
go ahead.
well, last question. Where do you see all this headed? Where are we going from here
You
especially
mean
in civil rights and well, really all rights, civil rights, women's rights, immigration rights.
yeah? Well, I think
'Cause
we're like go ahead.
I think they're all tied together.
You're right. I think it's a very tricky moment because in a way, I keep using this word genius, but on the left, you need somebody who's such a great strategist or a group of people who are such great strategists because it's almost like three-quarters of the power in the nation is like on the right, like the Supreme Court, both houses of Congress, the president. It's almost, and so what do we have left? In maybe a podcast, maybe some ability to get information to voters and to make information about what's really happening in the country as interesting as like like the running back statistics on Sunday, and I'm not sure how to do that, but we can go little by little, and I think there's some leaders out there who are just really great makers uh, of the case for like civil rights, uh, but do it in a way that can appeal to ordinary people like Bernie Sanders,
Hmm.
AOC. Like these people are like really smart, and but they seem to have their pulse, their fingers on the pulse of ordinary voters. Like AOC asked her voters, how come some of you voted for me and voted for Trump? She didn't say like, the hell with you, you voted for Trump. And
Right.
I think we need more of that. We need more information about, like, why do people make these decisions? What kind of information do they need to know, and how do we get it to them? One big problem is that the media, like, it's like it's such a broken and kind of craven institution, in my opinion, that I don't know how you can get information through it. And so in a way, maybe we need to build up this alternative network of outlets, like, like yours.
Well, I've got bad news for you.
Yes.
That
Uh-oh.
I just saw the top 10 podcasts rankings, and 9 out of 10 are conservative podcasts. There's
All
only
right.
one liberal one, and that's which one? Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway. That's the
But
only.
then that's not really a liberal anyway. They're kind of like,
Compared to the rest of
comparatively,
them, they are.
comparatively, yeah. Well, and yeah, and I guess one thing about Galloway, I've seen him, and he I guess maybe one weakness the liberals have is that they always talk about nuances. And Galloway, he doesn't do much nuance. He says this
No, he
is
doesn't.
this and this is that, and I guess that's the thing. Like, you have what policy is all about nuances, and improving things is all about, like, how, like, it doesn't work as well in this neighborhood as it might work in that neighborhood. And so, how do you make nuances exciting? I guess maybe
Well,
that's another thing.
it's just like policy needs to be like a title of your book. You put the best title you could on your book to hook people to want to read it. And that's
Yes,
basically what you have to do with policy. You don't need to, that's why you read the book after you like the idea of the book. And I think that's what
yeah,
people need to do with policy as well.
yeah, 100% agree. 100%. So, last thing, like Frank Luntz, nowadays he puts himself forward as a kind of down the middle guy who's, like, really in a state of grief over the divisions in America. But he made his reputation as this kind of Republican wordsmith, and that's what he did. Like, oh, sorry, that's my phone.
That's right.
All right, hold on.
Sure.
I'm just gonna turn it off. That's all. Sorry.
No
It's like
problem.
somebody wants money. um, but Frank, he made his reputation by with these words, like, where he would characterize immigration as an invasion, and these things that would, like, appeal to emotion, and appeal to fear, as we were saying before. And it's been very successful. And I'm not saying that liberals need to appeal to fear. I guess it's hard to appeal to joy the way Kamala Harris is trying to do. But is there a way to do that?
Well, I think the candidate matters in this case. And obviously, Barack Obama was able to do the hope thing for sure.
Yes, yes,
Um, so it can be done. And, obviously, there's a lot of structural things involved because George W. Bush's second term was so bad, the economic collapse, the invading a country for no good reason,
yes,
that happened, and that's why we really got Obama. I think not only,
yes,
I mean, he's a generational politician for sure,
yes.
but without that, we don't get Obama. I don't think, and I don't think
You're right. You're right.
we don't get Trump. Actually, I don't think Trump would have lost if not COVID would have never happened. I think he
That's
would have
right.
won
That's right.
again.
That's
And
right.
so any inflation was so bad. I think like people want to complain about Harris's campaign. I don't have any complaints whatsoever about her. I thought she ran a great campaign, and I don't know what more she could have done. She was in a tough spot. She couldn't totally just trash Biden because she was part of the administration. So she's in a tough spot there. So I mean, she was going to lose probably no matter what, just because of inflation. And that's just bad luck. If you're the
Yeah.
incumbent and you have inflation, you are going to lose.
Yeah. It's short, but I got a 2-hour rant about that.
Yeah. Okay.
The short
Well, hey,
version
can I
is
have you back on? We'll do the full one
okay.
later.
All right. Okay.
We'll
So,
save it. We'll save it.
okay.
But
All right.
one thing, we'll close this on Frank Luntz, since you brought Frank up.
Yeah.
After the election was over, he said the reason why Trump won was because of paycheck to paycheck Americans.
No, I mean, I think that's go
and
ahead.
and the first thing that happened after Trump got elected, the stock market went through the roof. Bitcoin went through the roof. The price of eggs and gas did not change. And I think that's the irony of this whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, if Trump does like half of what he says he's going to do, like the paycheck to paycheck people are going to be in trouble. So, and the Victorian people are going to be fine. So, I guess to be continued.
Yes. Well, Michael, I thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and giving your expertise and enlightening everybody about this really important subject of anti-civil rights.
Thanks. It's been a real pleasure. Have a great one.
Thank you. And I definitely want to have you back on, and we'll give it 6 months and have you back on, and we'll do some more.
I have a rant for you. Okay.
Good.
I have a rant in the cooler.
And right. Yeah, we will. I'll touch base with you in about 6 months, and good luck with the book and everything else.
Okay, you too. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Thanks for checking out this week's episode. I want to thank Michael again for taking the time to share his knowledge and expertise on this very important subject. It's a movement that is dramatically affecting many American lives. Hopefully in the future, we can get back to a space where affirmative action is recognized as strategic and an important policy that attempts to overcome past and current racism and racist attitudes. Thanks for listening and watching. Take care, and I hope everyone has a great week.